It's so today I'm going to be talking about going live for $0. This is not meant to be a how to. This is very much meant to be a how I did it and not a how you should do it. Keen to hear any feedback or ideas on improvements that would be easy or quick or straightforward or what have you. But this is basically how I got from nothing to an app that hopefully will start to see a lot of widespread use. So, to start off, I'm James. I'm a full stack web developer. I've been working in engineering since late 2014, so very nearly a decade of web development experience. Started off before that, though, as a teacher. I was teaching high school mathematics, and my degree is in early childhood and elementary education. So, kind of a strange background for an engineer, but I think it serves me well. Uh, I also really think that technology has a lot of potential, and we can really leverage that if we start to look at things in a certain way. Um, I've always been a huge proponent of open source, free as in beer and free as in speech. And undercutting the big guys is something that the first startup I was with for 8 years, we did such a good job of undercutting the big guys that the big guys bought us and turned it into office space. So I left, took my leave, and joined a different startup. And that was going well. And Silicon Valley Bank folded, and all the projects dried up. So found myself out of work at the beginning of April of this year, and decided to actually take some time to invest in a project that I'd had on my mind for a long time and didn't have the time or energy or maybe all of the skill set to realize it. So obviously we need context, and the context of DevOps is generally a project. And my project is zipcaptions.app. It came to me because they announced that .zip was available as a top level domain, and I thought, hey, that'd be fun to buy. So spent some money on it, and then discovered that it's a really, really poor choice of TLD. So .app became the fallback because that's not blocked by most corporate firewalls. Um, so what is Zip Captions? It's a progressive web app built in Angular, and its job is to do speech to text. Obviously, in Zoom, it's a nice feature to be able to have. As a teacher, I think it would be wonderful to have speech to text available for all of your students all of the time. And the contexts in which it could be useful and helpful are a lot wider than I initially had imagined. Um, but the important thing to me is that accessibility is really only valuable if it's accessible. And the idea of requiring a paid subscription or requiring a user sign up or requiring a several click tech intensive process was not embodying the whole principle of accessibility. Because if it's not able to be used by people who want to use it, it's failing in its prime value proposition. The whole point is that it needs to be accessible. So, putting this together, I partnered with a friend and former colleague of mine, and we came up with sort of some guiding principles on what we want to do. And there's a mission and a method to it. The mission is we want to make this as available as possible, as accessible as possible, which means it has to be free. There's no reason we can't figure out a way to leverage existing technology that people have already paid for to provide this service. And we can do that if we're creative. We can do that if we're critical thinkers. So we really do have to explore opportunity. We really have to not accept that, uh, there is a limit or there's a requirement for a sign up or something like that. We can find ways to put those decisions or those responsibilities in the hands of our users and allow them to opt into as much or as little as they'd like. We also want to make as many features available for free to everybody. And when I say as many features as we can, that means we intend on making paid features. That's going to be part of it because some of the tech I really want to play with ain't cheap. And I would like to be able to actually offer that ability and that performance and that option for users who would like it. But the way we do that is going to be very, very important. This is an open project. That means we need to be sure that we are not charging for function. If you're charging somebody for function, there's nothing stopping them from cloning the repo, stripping out the artificial barriers, and just hosting it themselves. And if they can do that, I would actually want them to. Charging for paid API access is something that I think we can put into the hands of users. So we can do things like allow a user to bring their own credentials. If you'd like to interact with OpenAI's API, enter or authorize the API or enter your key here. So it's sort of a bring your own with you. It means, number one, we're not restricting access artificially. Number two, we carry no risk for running up a huge bill accidentally through somebody else's misuse. I know my own limits as a coder, and I want to make sure that I have done all the James proofing that I can on this project. But it also means we can offer the ability to allow users to pay for convenience. So if you would like to have access to these paid features, but you don't want to go through the whole rigmarole of signing up and creating your own cloud project on this platform and hooking it up with the API key, eventually the plan is we would be able to manage all of that for you, and that would contribute to the costs. But the key thing that is going to make Zip Caption successful is not earning revenue. It's not maintaining or growing a set of paid features. The key value is the users and the community. I think that's true for every open source project. And my goal is for the code base and the user base to become something much greater than what we've started, so that we can go on to actually have something that's long lasting and is in the hands of everybody. Our mission statement was, we don't aim to make a profit, we aim to make a difference. We got our first supporter on Patreon last week, which I'm really excited about because we're now only a couple $100 in the red on the budget for this project. But that's okay because it's going to take a long time to grow a community, and my aspiration for it is it can become something where if we end up with a surplus of revenue, we can start doing things like putting accessibility tech into schools, partnering with cart providers so they actually have a live human transcripting. And if we can increase access to very expensive services like that by putting together a community who's getting value from something we can operate very, very cheaply, then we are overall adding value. And that to me has always been the dream. I want to make something that adds more than it takes away. So how do we do that? Well, everybody's got to start somewhere. And I started with what I'm familiar with, which is the browser and writing a simple client application. Because Chrome and Safari both have their own browser APIs available that they run the speech detection on. You get it for free if you're using that browser. So the principle of minimum viable product said, this is how to do it. And it ought to be fairly straightforward. So I put together a proof of concept. And then we get into a little bit more, like we want to make sure that it works on a large screen display. So we've got full screen now, but we're still in the client application realm, but we're starting to get a little more complexity. The next piece really upped the complexity because now we want real-time peer-to-peer connections so that if I'm up on stage presenting and I've got the big screen up on the side with my captions, I'd also like someone in the audience to be able to just open their phone and see the text on their phone. Maybe they can't see because there's someone tall like me sat right in front of them blocking the screen. So I put together a simple Socket.io server and Pure.js server. I thought, okay, all we're doing is signaling. That'll be cheap and easy to run. I can just host that. So now we've got a client application, but we've also got a backend. And then we've also got to make sure that our client can manage the connected peers. And now we've got an integration into OBS Studio as well. And these things are all building on top of each other because we've got users who are asking us, hey, I'm a streamer. I'd love to be able to stream the captions into my live stream. Well, of course, we can try and figure that out. So we're starting to get into the point where we've got enough complexity that it makes sense to think about our next steps. It's going to be a proper back end, and we're going to have a full-fledged cloud solution. But because I'm looking at this as an open source project, it is meant to be portable. It is meant to be reproducible. It is meant to be as free and open as possible. That means no vendor lock-in. I'm an Angular developer. Angular was developed by Google. It's used widely on Google Cloud Platform. That is my happy place. But that is an expensive place to spend your own money. And I've always spent someone else's money there. And this project's a little different. So we've got the same kind of problems in this project as we do in other ones. You know, there's code, there's budget. Obviously, budget is a big problem in this one because we have absolutely no profitability model and no intention on ever developing one. And we've also got marketing, we've also got support. There's even more than this. We've got, you know, paperwork and registering business stuff. And here in Quebec, you got to do that in French. But I'm very, very lucky. I've got a buddy who is willing to do that. So my job is code on a budget. And that's something I know how to do. So let's actually get to the DevOps part. Now that you know what the heck it is we're building and deploying, how did I get it to actually be live? So, like I said, we started with client hosting, and it was just a client application, and that's really, really simple. So I like Cloudflare. I use their stuff for my home, my self-hosted smart home and other stuff like that. So I figured easy, we'll use GitHub Pages, and I'll just build the application and host it from the docs folder on the main branch. And okay, it requires client build manually on the main branch, and I'll happily admit I have forgotten that a couple of times and thought, why the heck isn't production updating? So it's not a great process, but it works, and it's very affordable. And the updates deploy by the default GitHub action that you get when you turn on GitHub Pages, because I needed a solution and I clicked the button and it worked. So we've got a very basic application, and the big difference in the actual build process was including the CNAME file in the actual published folder so that every time I built the application, I didn't have to recommit that file as well. So really simple in terms of DevOps because I'm a I'm the engineer with the arts degree. I'm barely a coder. So this felt like a comfortable place I could live. And setting up DNS with Cloudflare was nice because then I get things like preventing DDoS attacks and basic stats and analytics. And of course, $0 is a price I'm happy to pay. So this is sort of a diagram of what we were doing with this build and deploy process, which is fine, works great, and built the app, published it, and turns out testing on mobile is not so simple. The first time, before we had any users, no problem, just push your changes live. But debugging and everything is not so simple on mobile. So what I have to do is run the local server and then connect to it over mobile. But that gets a little bit annoying because then I've got to start thinking about self-signed certificates and dealing with reverse proxying on my local machine, which is also running the whole emulator and then connecting to it. And it just became kind of a pain in the butt. So I decided, okay, I need an actual staging environment. I need the ability to test on mobile. When we were building and deploying the peer-to-peer connectivity feature, I needed the ability to connect to the same instance from multiple devices and across multiple networks as well. So we need this release candidate to be served over HTTPS so that the browser gives me access to the speech recognition API. We need it built from the develop branch, not the main branch, and we need it public, but obscure. There's nothing sensitive here. There's no exposed data because we don't have user accounts. We don't have any data. So I'm not worried about people stumbling across the dev build. And I thought, how am I going to solve this problem? I need to rely on something, and I need it to be something that I feel comfortable with. So Docker, because that just felt like it's something I'm already using in my basement. I know how this works. I know I can figure it out. So I figure Docker's going to be where staging lives. So obviously, if I want Docker to work, there's going to be some parts to it. So there's the Docker file in the actual project, and it's the build instructions. So the images, the environment variables, all of the build for all three environments. I can run it using the Docker Compose that's committed in the repository to just start up my local dev environment on my local machine. I can run it through a GitHub action or with a staging target and have it actually build for a different environment. And finally, I've got production, which was the last piece. So each one of these images is built through a multi-step build process. This took me a long time to figure out because I'm very, very happy to use Docker images, but building them was a whole different ballgame. So there's some parts in there that are not ideal because it's all a work in progress. So we've also got the corresponding GitHub action that's actually going to use the Docker file. So rather than doing all of the building and committing on my local machine, I thought, okay, so we're going to set up a GitHub action for both the client and the server, and they're going to check the relative paths. I'm using a mono repo for this whole code base. So it means everything's in the same repo. And if I've only changed the client, I don't really want the server image to build. I only want it to execute when I push to develop because I'm using feature branches and merging things down. So this is only for the next release candidate. So anytime I merge down a feature, it should come into the next release candidate by itself. So the GitHub action will build the image and then push it to Docker Hub. And it's a pretty straightforward kind of thing cobbled together from Stack Overflow because that's how I do all of the things I do. So the human pushes the change or merges the PR to the develop branch. I use Git flow, which is sort of a branch for each feature that you're working on. It allows me to do things like discover that the Zoom integration for closed captioning requires you send all of the traffic from a backend because they don't have a CORS header, so I can't send it from the client, which is kind of frustrating. But that's the life of a dev. So we've got the client and the server Docker file that defines everything, and we set up the environment variables. And basically, the environment variables just tell the client what server to talk to. GitHub checks, it pushes to Docker Hub if required, and then Docker Hub adds the tagged image or just updates it if it's an update. So the build process automatically adds the tag of the branch name. So I will have a bunch of images in the Docker Hub repo, but the only one that's really interesting is the develop tag. So that's all the build and deploy. Now I've got all the code pushed to Docker Hub. How do I get it to actually run on my server? So I've got Docker Compose running in my basement, and it's running zip captions. So it's pulling that container, but it's also running Cloudflared. And I don't know if anybody's familiar with Cloudflared, but it is an image that allows you to set up and use Cloudflare tunnels. And Cloudflare tunnels are pretty nice because they let me set up ingress into my network without any open ports, without any custom rules. And if you look at who that DNS address resolves to, it's not my house, it's Cloudflare. They're caching things for me, and they're dealing with a lot of that stuff for me. So it's a really, really nice product that's available for free at low scale. Another container I've got running is Ouroboros, which is basically just checking to see if there's an update for the image and auto pulls it and updates it. That's because I'm often too lazy to actually just SSH into the server and do it myself. Cloudflare tunnels are managing how the traffic gets routed, and that's done through the Docker network. So like I said, I'm not opening any ports. And in fact, none of these containers have their ports open on the Docker host. So the traffic comes into the Cloudflare tunnel, hits the right route, and then gets directed on that network to the correct configured public host name. So that's our basic front end setup. But now we've got back end hosting as well. So I need to have this back end actually pull and build, but I need one for staging and one for production. And I don't have a cloud provider. So I need a Socket.io connection for broadcasting, which means it's got to always be on. And I need a Peer.js signaling server so that once they're connected to the Socket server, they can actually discover each other and communicate. And constant uptime does not come cheap as far as I've been able to find. Cheapest I can find is about $5 a month, and that's about $5 a month more than the budget allows. So again, we've just got Docker Compose running, but this time we've got the server in the basement as well. So let's get into some actual code bits of it. This is the project repository here. So this is my Docker file that defines all of the build. And all of the build happens on a node environment that's based on Alpine Linux. And we're just copying everything over from that base image and installing it. This is in an NX workspace. So it's got both the client and the server in the same Docker file. So staging, this is my staging environment, and I set up the environment variables before running the client build. So when you build the client, those environment variables end up hard-coded into the build. It's a little bit different from regular usage of environment variables in Angular, but this allows me to use environment variables common between the client and the server. So when I build the server, obviously I'm setting a slightly different environment variable because I'm setting the allowed origins, but that just allows me to make sure that it sets the proper CORS headers. The backend server is actually fairly large because it ends up coming from the node build itself, which I believe is about a 3 gigabyte image. But the client is served from Nginx Alpine. So the Docker file builds it with all the environment variables, and then all it does is copy the final built package over to an Nginx Alpine instance and expose it on port 80. So that's the Docker file that defines the Docker build. And this is the GitHub automation that defines when the client build should happen. So basically, we're just checking to see if anything in the client package has changed and it's on push to develop. Then we're going to use our secrets to sign into Docker Hub and just build and push with the appropriate tags. So GitHub has some nice UI around the secrets and everything, and I just sort of hooked into that. The next bit is the actual Cloudflare tunnel. So Cloudflare gives you the ability to set up tunnels for any website that you've got pointed at their name servers. So we can set up public host names that point to specific URLs on my Docker network. And we can actually edit those as well, just live. So if I go to this website here, one.dash.cloudflare.com, this will take me into the Zero Trust dashboard, or it would if it had remembered my sign in. And then we can go to access here and click on tunnels, and I can set up tunnels. So obviously the first tunnel that I've got is for my Home Assistant instance, and this is managed remotely by Home Assistant. This tunnel here for zip captions, I'm just managing it manually, but in the future, an improvement would be to actually set it up so it's managed via API. But by managing the tunnel, I can click here to public host name and then choose which one I want to configure. So we've got subdomains for the socket server and the peer server, and the actual development candidate client is at next.zipcaptions.app. So if I look at the configuration here, the URL is actually the container name defined on the Docker network and the port. But port 80 is default, so I didn't specify it for the client. But if I go over to my server's Docker Compose file, so now we're on the server that's in the basement, and it's already running Docker because I've got a bunch of crap running because that's what I do. So I added Cloudflare, and the only thing you need to set up with Cloudflare is the tunnel token. So when you create a tunnel, copy the token, you drop it into an environment file, and then you can reference it in your Docker Compose file. And the token both identifies and authenticates your connection. So I've got a specific network defined called zip captions. And that's because I've got a lot of other containers running on this. You can probably see a bunch of them there. But I want to keep this traffic sort of isolated. So I've got Cloudflare running just on the zip captions network, not on the default. And then I've got my client, and it points at my image and the tag develop. So the nice thing is when I'm working on a different feature branch, if I'd like to actually build, test, deploy, and run it as the next release candidate, all I need to do is change this reference here and run the GitHub action from the command line. Same thing here for the server, but the server actually takes an environment variable because it's not compiled at runtime the way the client is. So the server, I've specified allowed origins, and I'm letting it connect to localhost. I'm also letting it connect to both the next release candidate as well as the production instance. Because, surprise, surprise, when you've got $0 for budget and you have 0 data sources on the back end and 0 PII, you don't really care about mixing, staging, and production because it is immaterial and irrelevant to the overall success of the project. And then, as I mentioned, we've got Ouroboros running as our other container, and all it's doing is checking the status and updating Docker images when they need to be pulled and updated. So there are problems and limits with this approach. There's a lot of problems and limits with this approach. That's why this is all done on a budget of 0. Obviously, QA and production sharing a backend is less than ideal, especially since it's running on volatile memory. So if I reboot that machine or make an adjustment or do something and restart that server while somebody's broadcasting, no one else is going to be able to join that broadcast because I've completely borked it. Production is manual still. Fragile memory state. The hardware it's running on is from 2011. It's almost as old as my children. This is not reliable stuff I'm building here, and there's no revenue to improve it. We hope that once we hit a few Patreon supporters, we're going to be able to afford a cloud instance. And that is really going to be a big step up because that means we're going to be able to take on more cool stuff. We're going to be able to actually build a full-fledged backend. That's really what I want to get into. I want things like user sign-in. It'd be great to be able to tell a user, yeah, your settings are just synced. You don't need to worry about it. A cloud hosting provider would really make things like OAuth sign-in and things like that easier. Cross-browser support is a huge one. I really don't like the vendor lock-in with Chrome and Safari. That means we're going to have to explore things like Hugging Face transformers and deprecating proprietary solutions and WebAssembly and OpenAI Whisper and custom corporate installs, and there's asynchronous integrations that we can, like, the list goes on and on. But really, this has been the start of an adventure, and I'm really stoked for where this is going because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not about building a company. This is not about building something that's going to get acquired. This is about building something that's going to be a collection of people who really want this to matter. So this is my aspiration. This is my dream. This is also my contact info. My website is educoder.dev. It is woefully out of date because what web programmer's website would be up to date? I like to spend my time building fun stuff, not talking about myself. I'm also on Mastodon as Educoder, and I also talk about fun stuff there. I post a whole lot of nonsense. And then my GitHub is github.com/that whole mess. But the easiest way to get to it is go to zipcaptions.app and click in the bottom left, and that'll take you to the GitHub repository. But I probably should have shown you what the app does, shouldn't I? Although I'm not sure how it'll like listening to many different microphones at the same time, but it appears to work. So this is the basic experience. Very simple, very easy, minor build complexity, and then it's just able to do what I want it to do. So thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate your time. And that's my whole spiel.